Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and today we're just chilling. This is going to be my most informal video, I guess. I just wanted to give a channel update, just kind of tell you what I've been reading, what I'm planning to read, and some exciting things that have happened with the channel this past week. This is going to be my first video where I don't really have any notes to go off of. It's going to be super off the cuff, so we'll see how it goes. It might be super rambly and disorganized, but you know, we'll just have to deal with it. So firstly, I wanted to start by giving some thanks to a couple other booktubers that have been super supportive and are the reason why I'm doing this update, because I wanted to talk about this. So first I wanted to mention Steve Talks Books and Stuff. He's a channel that's been super supportive of me since I started 2 months ago and has liked my videos and he's retweeted them and shared them, and he's been so generous and supportive. And this past week he put out a shout out video where he was shouting out some other booktubers that he was a fan of, that he thought, you know, maybe let's get some more views on these channels, and mine was one of them. And I'm super thankful for him making that video, because since that video has come out, I've jumped 20 subscribers. When he put that video out, I was at 35, in and around 35, I think, subscribers. And as of a couple days later, recording this video, I'm at 55 now. So it's been the biggest jump I've seen since I've started. So I'm so thankful for the shout out that he gave me and the attention that I'm receiving, and just wanted to show some appreciation for what he did. I also wanted to thank Bryce from Shelf Centered, who's been super supportive as well. He retweeted a bunch of my stuff and he helped me get the biggest spike in views that I've gotten so far. And he's also a channel that I really enjoy, and he's super funny, and he's slowly convincing me to make that dive and get into the Malazan or Malazan books. That's a series that's been on my TBR for a while, and I've slowly started collecting the used copies of, but every time he talks about it in one of his videos, I want to read it more and more, but I don't want to start reading those as I'm going to start reading The Wheel of Time, which is something I'm also going to talk about today. And I guess I should mention the books that I've been reading since I started the channel. So everything that I reviewed that has come out in the past 2 months, I did read in this time frame since starting, save for The Dark Tower, which I finished about a month before I created the video for it. But there's some books that I haven't mentioned yet. So the first book I read, I think I read this back at the beginning of September, right around when I was starting the channel, that I didn't necessarily want to review, is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. This is a book that I've struggled with before in the past and wasn't able to finish, and I tried reading this in my first year of university, so I think I was 19 when I picked this up. And even though the book itself was only 90 pages, I just couldn't get through it. It was so dry for me, and I think at the time I couldn't really appreciate some of the more deep or intellectual concepts about it. And so it sat on my shelf for literal years unfinished. And then this past summer, when I started getting more into the books that the library had, I went for the audiobook, and since it was only 3 or 4 hours, I'm like, okay, you know, that's not a huge commitment. I think I can finally finish this story if I just listen to the audiobook, because at least it'll be entertaining, someone will be reading it, and I could finally find out what happened at the end. Although in the meantime, I have seen Apocalypse Now, so I kind of get what happens, even though it's very different from the book. And to be honest, I had just little interest about it this round as I did the first time. Firstly, the audiobook narrator, I just couldn't get into his voice. His voice was just very loud and abrasive, and I couldn't get into the actual content of the book. I think that prevented me from even getting past his voice. So I struggled with that, and that 3 or 4 hours felt like 15 or 20 just because I could not get into the content, and I just don't think that I vibe with this book very well. I've read plenty of other books from this time period and stuff that I love and think is much more easy to read, entertaining, and fulfilling, and this just wasn't one of those books for me. So I can say I finished Heart of Darkness and it just wasn't for me. Next we have Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom, and this was a book that I've heard about for my entire life. It's a classic, everyone knows it. It's essentially the memoir of someone who reconnects with his old university professor who happens to be suffering from ALS and doesn't have much time before he's going to pass away. So they reconnect and they have these little classes every Tuesday and talk about philosophy and life, and it's very sad. And I knew it was sad getting into it, but you know, it still takes you a bit by surprise when you actually go through those parts, and it was very affecting. And it was kind of funny actually how I stumbled on this book. I was on a hike and totally wasn't expecting to, you know, find a book that day, and I just happened to pass by a signpost where it was directing me on the trail or the path, and the book was just lying there. And it turns out it was one of those things where it was a take a book, leave a book situation, but in this case they just wanted you to take it. It was, I think, the book fairies that left this, and I was so surprised. I'm like, okay, you know, it's this classic I haven't read, I need to pick it up. There's literally a book just staring at me in the middle of nowhere. So I took it home and read it and really enjoyed it, and now as I finished it, I need to find a place to hopefully pass it on to someone else. And third, we have 1408 by Stephen King. This is actually the short story collection Everything's Eventual, of which I've read a couple short stories in there before. I read the actual story Everything's Eventual because of its relation to a character in The Dark Tower, and The Little Sisters of Eluria, which features Roland, the protagonist, also from The Dark Tower. I was reading those after I finished the series and didn't quite want to let it go just yet, so I've been in this collection before and was enjoying it. And this past weekend, me and my girlfriend went away to a small cabin a couple hours from where we live in a nice beautiful area that I've never been to, and it was so cozy, but unfortunately it rained a lot, so we were stuck inside. And I brought Everything's Eventual with me because I knew having a good spooky read in this cabin in the middle of October would be very atmospheric and moody and match the vibe of the book. And I thought 1408 was maybe a good one to go with. It wasn't too long, so I wouldn't be reading all weekend, and I've seen the movie and I enjoyed it, although it's been a few years since I watched it, so I don't necessarily remember how good it is. But I thought the short story was fun. It was very fast. It was only about 50 pages, I think, in this copy, and I wasn't expecting so much of that story to be the build-up to the actual haunted hotel room, where it's a conversation between the writer who wants to rent it out and try to survive the night, and the manager of the hotel who tries to persuade him not to go in there. And with that, all the haunting stuff happened very fast, but it was pretty creepy and effective, and a short story that I'm gonna remember fondly. So that's it for what I've read over the last couple of months. Now I want to get into kind of what I'm reading now and will be reading very soon. So as of right now, I'm struggling a little bit. This is the first time I'm trying to read 2 books at once. I'm listening to an audiobook and reading a physical book at the same time, and trying to balance them, you know, during a weekday is a big struggle for me. I've never been able to do this, so I'm having a bit of a hard time. But I'm listening to the audiobook of Ghost Story, book 13 in the Dresden Files. If you've seen my Changes review, you know that, you know, I'm at this point in the series, and I talked about how I wasn't expecting that the narrator of this book, as I'm listening to the audiobook, is a different person. They couldn't get the guy who's done the whole series to do this one particular book, so they have a different narrator. However, I did learn that they later re-recorded the book with the proper narrator. However, the version that my library has is the one that doesn't match the rest of the series. So when I put this on in my car for the first time, it said narrated by John Glover. I kind of took a step back and went, okay, what's going on here? And I almost didn't want to listen to it altogether because I thought, you know, this isn't the voice of the main character. I need to have that voice or read it in print or an ebook. But the narrator is actually doing a pretty good job. He's not the voice of the main character, so it's a bit different, but I think he's actually doing well. And at this point, I'm about halfway through the book, and I'm just going to continue on with it. There's no reason to quit at this point. And now that I know that the remainder of the audiobooks are recorded by the guy who's supposed to do all of them, I'll be much more comfortable in going forward and listening to those audiobooks, as I want to do that over reading the print or ebook version for the rest of the series. And Ghost Story is pretty good so far. I mean, it has, you know, big shoes to fill after Changes, but I'm enjoying the story. I know a lot of people maybe struggle with this one, but it's hard to follow up a story like Changes. And I think the concept and the arc of the story has been very interesting so far, and what has become of the characters since the end of Changes is something I'm looking forward to developing more and seeing where it goes even past this book. I'm also currently reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is one that popped up as #1 on the top 10 horror books that I want to read, and Frankenstein was a big gap for me. I've actually had this copy on my shelf for maybe 3 years, and I just never found a good time to get into it. But I thought this year I'm gonna really commit to reading some good spooky stuff, and I thought what better way to get into the last part of October and approaching Halloween than by reading Frankenstein. And in the last remaining days of October, I am gonna finish the completed works of H.P. Lovecraft. If you saw my review of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, I said there that that was the last big Lovecraft story I had to read and only had 2 short stories left in his entire completed works. I bought a huge set, like one of those giant books of his completed fiction, so I only have The Shadow Out of Time and Haunter of the Dark, which is his last written story, remaining. And this has been about a 3-year process for me getting through his entire completed works. It hasn't been, you know, a joy the whole way through. There's been some rough stuff in there, some bad stories. And I said in that review that there's gonna be no more Lovecraft stories, so it's sad for me that I won't have anything else of his to read. But there's been so many interpretations of his works that have come out from authors since he passed away. And I'm actually interested in getting into the Alan Moore comic series that deals with the Lovecraft mythos, which I had heard of before, but Steve in one of his videos broke it down really well and made it sound very exciting. So I think once I'm done with the Lovecraft proper, I'm gonna move on to some of the works that were inspired by his mythos. And now the big one, the big thing, the thing I've been hyping up for a while, that's been on my TBR and that I've mentioned probably in every video since I've started making them. On November 1st, I'm starting The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time was the first big series I had heard of when I first started watching booktube videos a couple years ago, and I couldn't believe it somehow escaped me that a series this big and definitive, I just never even knew it existed. And over the last year, when I started collecting used books and collecting fantasy series especially, I always kept a lookout for The Wheel of Time, and I've slowly built up my collection, and now I'm only missing 2 books in the series, that being New Spring, the prequel, and A Memory of Light, which is the last book. But this is one that I don't know if I'm ready to read yet. It's so soon. Because I want to read it in time for the show coming out, I want to be able to review this and talk about it and engage in the discussion about the show, which I think the first part of the first season is going to cover the Eye of the World. So I want to be part of that big experience. And this year I'm going to be coming off of 2 big fantasy series, that being The Dark Tower, which, you know, is only 8 books and not nearly as big as The Wheel of Time, but also the Dresden Files. I'm gonna be probably finishing, or at least catching up in the next couple months as well. So there's gonna be a big epic fantasy size hole that I'll need to fill, and The Wheel of Time, I think, is the series that's gonna do it for me. Everything I've heard about this makes it sound like it's gonna be great. So that's it for now. I hope this informal, kind of messy structure works okay for you. I actually enjoy doing it, although it's not necessarily what I'm the most comfortable with. I like having some set notes, especially for reviews and stuff, but I guess in this situation it's okay. So in the comments, let me know what you've been reading or what you've been up to, and if you have any big reading things coming up, like how I have The Wheel of Time that I'm going to get into, if you're starting a new series, a new gigantic series, or just excited to read any particular book, let me know. Remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.